Today I wanted to talk about the Panasonic S1R. I'm Owen Howard, howard.io. Let's go. Before we get this review underway, I just wanted to do a few disclaimers. Panasonic has not lent me this camera or anything like that. I own this camera. I do, however, have a owner's bias because I spent my hard-earned money on it, and so you can definitely take that into account when you're listening to this review. One more thing is I also work at a camera shop. I will leave a link to our shop in the description, but it's not a affiliate link, so I won't make any money if you do buy anything from there. That's just if you want to have a look, because I quite like the people I work with. Okay, first things first, I thought I'd get into the build quality. Got a mostly metal construction with a large amount of rubber on the outside just to make it grippier and also go with that Panasonic aesthetic that they've had going for quite a while. It is quite heavy. It's around 1 kilo for the body alone, and then this lens that's kitted with it, it ends up becoming around 2 kilos. In total, it's quite heavy. But that being said, it does have a very rugged feel, and it's got some of the best weather sealing on the market. I'd say it's not quite as good weather sealing as Olympus or Leica, but it's definitely up there. Since you're watching this review here and you're possibly not able to actually go into a shop and try it out, I thought I'd mention a little bit more about the way it feels. While it is very heavy, it does have a very deep grip for you to hold. And if you have larger hands like I do, then it can actually be one of the most comfortable cameras on the market, even though it is heavier. Especially, I really like this part here, where your thumb meets the camera, because it gives you a really nice grip. And I feel very secure holding the camera, especially when I'm doing back button focusing as well. I just feel like the camera is really locked into my hands. Going from the grip, we'll look at the dials. So we've got our mode selection dial here, and you have to hold down this little button to turn it. The dial itself feels quite nice. It's made out of metal with a nice kind of bumpy finish here. Right below that, we've got our drive mode selector. I pretty much only ever use the single shot for this low setting that you actually can set in the camera yourself. I just set it to the fastest speed that you can do with mechanical shutter, because I just find that this camera is not particularly fast with that, but I'll get to that later. The rear dial is also made of metal, and it feels really good, a lot better than a lot of the competition in the market. The front dial is rubber, but it feels, again, a lot better than a fair few other places, though not as good as some other companies. This rear dial too, one thing I really love about it is that you can actually click the directions you want to go, so it's kind of a best of both worlds scenario. I think it's probably one of my favorite rear D-pads of any of the cameras on the market. Continuing on with the back, we've got this rear screen. It's a folding up, down, and out that way. When the camera was announced, a lot of people had a lot of problems with this because it didn't swivel out like a Canon R5, for example. And I gotta say, honestly, I prefer the screen like this because especially if you're shooting down like that, which I tend to do quite a bit when I'm trying to get low down vertical shots, I just find that lining that up and also handling like that is a lot nicer than having a screen down here. That is 100% a personal preference though, and I think that it's honestly one of those things where you kind of have to try it out yourself and see what you like. One more thing that I think is really interesting, probably not going to be able to see this on camera, but if you're in the dark, you can turn on lights to light up the buttons that you have, just in case you're having a bit of trouble finding them. Last thing about the build, are the cards and the battery. So I've got this really robust card door, which has 2 card slots. One's a CF Express and one is a SD card. Honestly, the CF Express card is amazing using that over the SD card, especially because of the huge file sizes. You're going to notice that you're buffering way less with the CF Express card. Moving back to the battery, one thing I really like about the Panasonic S1R battery is opening the battery door just is so nice and easy. On some other brands, I find that the battery door has a very finicky, really little switch they have to pull, and I really just don't like that. I much prefer this nice big tactical switch there. And then spring-loaded battery, you just easily pull it out. With a little bit more class than that though. Next up, we're going to talk about the usability of the camera. This is something that I think a lot of people, you can't really find through the spec sheet by looking at it. The big thing about this camera, which I think is one of the reasons that a lot of people completely overlook it, is the autofocus. So this camera uses Panasonic's DFD, or depth from defocus autofocus, which is a contrast-based system, in contrast to the phase detection contrast hybrids that almost every other company at the moment uses. It's definitely not as reliable for things like video, or especially for tracking moving subjects, things like running people, flying birds, like that. I think you're going to find that your hit rates are going to be significantly lower with a camera like this than it will be with a camera that uses a phase detection system. That's just because using the contrast detect autofocus system, the camera doesn't know which way it has to move to make the focus sharper. And that's just a limitation that I think we're going to have with a system like this for a very long time. That being said, it does have some really good features for its autofocus. So this section here, you can pretty much control almost everything you need to for autofocus on this camera. First thing we have here is the joystick, which we can use not only for navigating the menus, but also for moving our autofocus points and selecting things like that. This AF on button I use for back button autofocus, so I have completely disconnected the shutter button from autofocusing at all, and then I just only have autofocus turn on when I press this button. That's the way that I personally like to have it, and I just think that the button placement, especially with my hands, is just in a really good spot, and it feels like it has a very good grip on the camera. Just next to that, we have one of my favorite features about this camera. It's got a autofocus mode selector, so we can go from single to continuous to manual focus just by pulling that, which can be really handy depending on what you're looking at. And then in the middle of there, you have another button where you can press this and it'll bring up the different autofocus modes you have for things like you can have single point, a larger area, intelligence, and then they also have some really interesting AI modes where they have a face and eye detection mode and a animal detection as well. I'm going to be honest, the face and eye detection mode is better than most other companies, even with their face detect. Speed-wise, it's not, like I wouldn't say it's faster than say a Sony or a Canon. I think that they're definitely faster, but the accuracy on the eye detection on this camera and the just feedback that it gives you with how smooth the box is and how you can see box around the face and a direct line to the eye that it's focusing on just makes you feel so much more confident when using the camera. And I think it's got to be one of my favorite systems. And then the animal autofocus has been really good through a lot of my use that I've had with it. I've tried it on dogs, tried it on cats, tried it on birds. Every time it's managed to spot them, One thing I will note though is that with dogs, sometimes when they're facing more away from you than towards you, it'll tend to focus on their butts rather than their faces, but I don't know, maybe the camera's a bit of a pervert. Moving on to the next function that I think is really great is the stabilizer. I'd say that the stabilizer on this camera is one of the best ones on the full frame market out there. Especially when you pair it with a lens like this kit lens that it comes with, and they work together in conjunction, you get amazingly low shutter speeds that you can do. I've seen people trying on the internet doing, like 6-second exposures handheld. It's pretty crazy. I'm not that steady, but I guess someday I might be. Another really underrated feature on this camera is the mechanical shutter. I think that this camera has one of the nicest mechanical shutters I've ever used, with the exception being a Leica M10P. The sound is really nice and muted. It's not too loud, and it has very, very little vibration at all. I pretty much always use the mechanical shutter unless I need to be absolutely dead silent. The other really great benefit of that shutter is that it actually has a faster sync speed with a flash, so you can go up to, I think it's 1/320th of a second as opposed to 1/250th, which is what most cameras have. I find that really helpful and I use it all the time. It also has some other really interesting features that I haven't really gotten a chance to use, like it has a function called post focus, where it takes a bunch of photos and then will let you pick the focusing distance after the fact. I personally haven't really used it that much and think it could be fun. But in that same vein, it also has a time-lapse function, which I know some people are quite interested in, but specifically to this camera, it has a function where it lets you set it up like you're doing a stop motion film, and you can do the individual frames and then have it actually just save to one movie file, which I think is amazing for people that want to do, say, Lego films, things like that. I know I used to be really into that when I was a kid, but didn't quite have the money for a camera like this then, and then now I just haven't had any time for things like Lego. Yeah, the last thing that comes in handy on this camera that I'd say is really worth checking out is the high resolution mode. It works a lot better than a lot of other brands like Canon and Sony because the file actually gets made in camera without you having to actually do any sort of external app on your computer and taking them all as separate photos. It just works, boom, as one together, and it ends up with a really, really high resolution photo that is very, very detailed. There are actually two options for it if you're looking at something with any sort of movement. One is to leave the artifacts as they are, and one of them is to try to smooth out any sort of movement artifacts. Personally, I'm not too big of a fan of how bushes and things like that slightly moving in the wind look from either of those two modes, but I think it handles things like water very well. Next up, in terms of topics we have to talk about, is image quality. So, first thing that most people look at when they're looking at a camera, especially if they're new to photography, is the resolution. When this camera was first announced, Panasonic made a huge deal about how this was the highest resolution interchangeable lens mirrorless camera with a full frame sensor on the market. It was only about 2 megapixels higher than Nikon's camera at the time and about 5 megapixels higher than Sony's one at the time. So not that big of a deal. It's about 47.5, I think, megapixels, but yeah, roughly just over 8K across. Another really important thing to look at is the dynamic range and file malleability. I think this camera is really good at recovering the shadows. If you underexpose and then bring them up in, say, Lightroom, you can pretty much keep the colors, keep the sharpness, the detail from quite dark. Highlights you can keep a little bit and pull down, but I definitely say expose to the left to protect your highlights if you can, because the shadows will bring up a lot more than the highlights will bring down. And speaking of bringing up the shadows, the high ISO performance and like low light performance in general, I think is actually quite good on this camera. It's there's this whole big debate going on online at the moment between high resolution cameras versus low resolution cameras for low light performance. I think all in all being the same, if you look at the image at the same size, it's not really going to be any sort of a deal. So I wouldn't choose a lower resolution camera over this one just because you think it'll perform better at higher ISOs. I think if you're wanting one specifically for that, check out for technologies like backside illuminated or a quad beta array or something like that, because I think you'll find that's a better option. Or even better yet, you could move up to medium format if it's really that important to you. That being said, medium format is incredibly expensive, so might want to avoid that. Another huge thing that impacts image quality, especially on high resolution sensors, is the lens choice. One reason that I actually love this camera is because you have some amazing options for your lens choices. You've got 4 variants. Was 3 when this camera came out, and then recently Lights Cine, which is Leica's cinema division, has joined the Common Alliance. At least I think they did. But anyway, the Panasonic options are all really nice. A lot of them are made out of like a plastic shell like this one with rubber on your rings. Almost all of the higher end ones at least are weather sealed. And the S Pro lineup that are designated with a red S, unlike this one, those ones are all certified by Leica. Not sure what that certification process involves, but they also tend to have a metal housing instead of this plastic like this. In terms of image quality though, I think, especially for the price, this lens is very good. It's got quite good sharpness corner to corner from 24 all the way out to 105, and it also doubles as a 1:2 macro, so it's kind of a do everything lens for this camera, and that's just the kit lens. You have some great options from Sigma as well if you're looking for something a lot more affordable. Like they've got this contemporary lineup, which are really small, fast but not super fast. For example, this is a 65mm f2. The build quality is really nice actually. They're made out of metal. The focus ring could be a little bit, I find on most of the Sigmas the focus rings are a little bit stiff, but that could just be because I quite like the way that the Leica ones feel. And yes, I recently got my first Leica lens, which is another great option. If you're looking for like ultimate image quality on this camera, the Leica range are absolutely amazing, especially lenses like this one, the Apo Vario Elmerit. The corner-to-corner sharpness is amazing, and they have very good control over things like chromatic aberrations, flaring. Everything is just really well controlled. Oh, that brings me to one other point. Sorry, the Panasonic lenses are all very well controlled for focus breathing. The Sigma ones tend to really suffer from that, and the Leica ones tend to be quite good for focus breathing as well. So the last thing I wanted to talk about for this camera is, who's this camera for? I think that the contrast detect autofocus is going to turn a lot of people off right away. But that being said, honestly, for most people, I don't think they actually need phase detection autofocus. I think phase detection is really useful and very important for, say, shooting birds in flight, or people playing football, or something where people are moving really quickly and kind of darting around. The autofocus in this will struggle to keep up, just being honest. That being said though, for almost everything, like especially weddings, things like that, the autofocus is absolutely perfect for that and not going to have any problems. Or if you're wanting something to photograph, especially things like you want to photograph your dog or something like that, the AI autofocus in this will actually make it a lot easier than using a face detection system with a single point if you're not great at keeping it on it. And it also just lets you kind of focus on your composition a little bit more. So I think that that's a really great feature. Another thing that I completely forgot to mention before is the colors on this camera are amazing. I really like it. In fact, one of the reasons I chose this camera is because I went into the Leica store to try out the M10, and I absolutely loved the colors on that. And then I had to go with this camera later, and I saw that the colors were not exactly the same, but kind of similar to that. In fact, the most similar out of the brands that I was looking at, because let's face it, I can't afford an M10. But yeah, I just absolutely loved the colors, especially the reds. I thought it just looked a lot nicer than the other brands on the market at the time. And I think that that's definitely if you're looking for really amazing image quality and wonderful colors, tones, gradation, things like that, but you can't afford, say, a Leica or a medium format camera, then I think that this is a great position to start, especially if you're wanting to do something like what I'm doing, where I bought the Panasonic because I can afford it, and then I'm using that to build up my lens collection with my Leica lenses. Granted, it's taken me a lot longer than I was originally hoping for to start the collection, but I've got my first one and we'll see how it goes from there. Yeah, and then eventually I'd love to upgrade to a Leica body when I can, but in the meantime, this body does everything I need for my professional work and for my personal work. I've shot weddings with it, I've shot portraits, even birds, things like that, and they blow up really great. I got like, let's see if I can find, you can print really big with them and they look absolutely amazing. I think you can print up to something like 20 by 30 with these images without doing any sort of interpolation in 300 dpi, which is kind of the biggest size that most like wedding clients, for example, would want. I don't think I've really had anyone ask for a print bigger than 20 by 30. And so being able to do that without any interpolation is amazing. And the lenses are sharp enough to resolve that. And so you can print it up there and it still looks amazing without having any sort of loss of image quality. And I definitely say that this is, if you're looking to get a camera for something like weddings or portraits, I definitely would say this is a great option for you to pick, especially if you want to get into that whole Leica ecosystem and don't want to be spending over $10,000 in your one sitting. I'd say that, yeah, kind of wraps up my overall experience with the camera. I might pop in a few more photos just to have a look while I kind of drone on until everyone gets bored and leaves, and then I guess I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.